Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. How do two neighboring nuclear-armed states maintain perfectly coherent yet entirely incompatible realities? Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description. So, I will be arguing from India's strategic logic today. Basically that this conflict is fundamentally about preserving established state sovereignty and countering state-sponsored terrorism.
Right. And I'll argue from Pakistan's strategic logic, which, posits that the conflict stems from an unresolved historical dispute, and what looks like volatility is actually just the necessity of asymmetric survival against a massively dominant neighbor.
Yeah, let's look right at the foundation of this stalemate, which is, of course, Kashmir. From India's perspective, the legality here is absolute. In 1947, the Instrument of Accession was signed.
Right, the borders were drawn.
Exactly, the borders were drawn. And because that legal framework is settled, India's reality is that there is no active territorial dispute in Kashmir today. The only ongoing issue is constant, deliberate external interference. You cannot have a functioning nation-state if your neighbor treats your settled geography as a permanently open negotiation.
Well, hold on. You're calling it a neatly closed legal matter, but let's look at the actual mechanics of that 1947 accession.
Okay.
We aren't just talking about a standard diplomatic treaty here. The ruler of Kashmir signed that legal instrument while actively under invasion by tribal militias.
Right, but...
So from Pakistan's view, a signature extracted under the barrel of a gun completely bypasses the fundamental right of the population to choose their own fate, which is exactly why the UN itself historically contemplated a plebiscite.
Okay, but think about the global precedent of rejecting that signature. Doesn't reopening settled borders from 1947 invite endless chaotic revisionism across the entire globe?
I don't think it's that simple.
Well, if you retroactively tear up a legally binding instrument of accession decades later, just because one party feels aggrieved by the historical context, you invite endless revisionism. If we accept that logic, the entire map of the world goes into a state of perpetual violent redrafting.
The problem with treating it as a purely closed contract is the empirical reality on the ground today.
What do you mean?
You don't park one of the densest military footprints on Earth in a territory that is organically and peacefully integrated. That massive security presence indicates the foundational question of self-determination was bypassed, not resolved.
But that heavy security presence is a direct reaction to external infiltration. It's not a symptom of domestic illegitimacy.
And because Pakistan fundamentally rejects that 1947 legal finality, but, lacks the conventional military size to challenge India head-on, it is practically forced into the shadows.
Right, the structural disadvantage.
Exactly. That structural disadvantage dictates their entire method of engagement. In a prolonged conventional conflict, Pakistan objectively loses to India's vastly larger economy and military. So they use proxies and intelligence operations as instruments of pressure.
Which India defines unequivocally as state-sponsored terrorism.
Right, but from the other side, it's about amplifying local resistance just to force India to the diplomatic table.
Yeah, but calling it amplifying local resistance ignores the actual mechanics of what is happening on the ground. The source material outlines India's reality clearly here. Pakistan is tolerating or even actively supporting armed non-state actors who cross sovereign borders to inflict mass violence.
Well,
you can't just frame this as a necessary geopolitical lever. It unequivocally destroys the accountability required of modern nation-states. It's essentially like fighting a formal duel where one participant secretly employs a hidden sniper in the trees. It completely breaks the rules of engagement and prevents any good faith negotiations.
Wait, let me push back on that formal duel analogy. Because India wrote the rules of that duel specifically because they have the larger military.
Well, they are the rules of modern statecraft.
Sure, but if Pakistan plays by those conventional rules of statecraft, they lose automatically. Asymmetry forces the weaker power to change the rules of engagement just to stay alive.
I hear you, but...
They aren't choosing indirect warfare out of pure malice. Asymmetry isn't cheating. It's the only law of physics available to the weaker state. It's a desperate compensation.
But relying on those ununiformed fighters completely destabilizes the region, right? Which forces us to look at the ultimate existential stakes, how these two countries handle their nuclear arsenals.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it gets really tense.
Exactly. India has deliberately adopted a no-first-use nuclear policy. By declaring we will only use nuclear weapons defensively, India removes the threat of sudden escalation.
Yes, which makes them look very responsible globally.
Right? This predictable posture is a tool of global integration. It's exactly why India enjoys broad international legitimacy. The world trusts a power that uses its ultimate weapons to guarantee stability.
But that is exactly the paradox we need to break down. For India, no first use is a tool of stability. For Pakistan, a no first use policy is an absolute trap.
A trap?
Yes, it's an invitation to conventional slaughter. Nuclear weapons aren't a symbolic badge of prestige. For them, they are the sole equalizer.
I see. Pakistan deliberately refuses to declare a no-first-use doctrine because that strategic ambiguity acts like invisible tripwires across a dark room.
Wait, invisible tripwires.
Exactly. India has a massive conventional army, but if they don't know exactly which step triggers a nuclear response, they are forced to stand perfectly still. The ambiguity isn't madness, it's the paralyzing agent. Okay, but treating deliberate uncertainty as a valid nuclear doctrine is basically playing Russian roulette with global security.
Well, you have to remember Pakistan's profound paranoia and vulnerability here.
Right. Their international position is precarious.
Very. They're expected to be an instrumental ally to the West in counterterrorism, yet they suffer deep violations of their own sovereignty. Look at the unilateral U.S. operation in Abbottabad.
Right, the bin Laden raid.
Exactly. When even your allies bypass your borders to conduct military operations, deliberate unpredictability becomes your only defense mechanism against the larger world.
I understand the vulnerability. I really do. But when you rely on invisible tripwires in the dark to compensate for conventional weakness, you aren't just deterring an adversary.
You think it guarantees a mistake?
Yes, you are practically guaranteeing an eventual, catastrophic miscalculation. Stability requires clear boundaries.
But from within Pakistan's strategic reality, it is the most rational calculation possible. True stability cannot possibly exist while massive structural imbalances and deep historical grievances remain unaddressed.
Right.
You cannot demand perfect conventional behavior from a state operating under a profound structural disadvantage.
And from the Indian perspective, regional security absolutely requires respecting established sovereignty, honoring the legal finality of borders, and categorically rejecting proxy terrorism.
Exactly.
What is truly chilling, and where our perspectives essentially converge today, is the realization that both of these states are acting entirely rationally within their own isolated strategic frameworks.
That is the immense value of examining conflicts through these dual lenses. If you only look at the Indian framework, Pakistan looks entirely rogue.
Right, unpredictable.
But if you only look at the Pakistani framework, India looks like a suffocating hegemon. Understanding this geopolitical stalemate requires recognizing that both systems possess deep internal consistency, driven by entirely different historical imperatives.
Which brings us right back to our two grandmasters at the table. Until we realize that one is trying to checkmate a king, while the other is trying to bluff a royal flush, we will never understand why the game in South Asia never seems to end.
Absolutely. There's definitely more to explore in the source material, especially regarding the history of the 1947 accession and these modern nuclear doctrines.
For sure. Well, we've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs.